unveiling the timeless epics of Homer. In the rich tapestry of ancient Greek literature, few figures loom as large as the enigmatic poet we know as Homer, though the details of his life remain shrouded in mystery. The enduring impact of his two great epic masterpieces, the Iliad and the Odyssey, is beyond dispute. These sweeping tales of heroism, tragedy, and the human condition have captivated audiences for millennia. As the presumed author of these foundational works, Homer's legacy has proven to be truly timeless, shaping the very foundation of Greek culture, education, and Western civilization as a whole. From the heroic exploits of Odysseus to the monumental clash of the Trojan War, Homer's epics have bequeathed us with some of the most iconic characters, scenes, and themes in all of literature. And through the power of storytelling, we can transport ourselves to these ancient realms, immersing ourselves in the rich tapestry of myth, legend, and timeless human drama. Join us on this captivating journey as we explore the depths of the Homeric epics. We'll delve into the historical and cultural contexts that gave rise to these works, unpack their enduring themes and symbols, and discover how Homer's vision has continued to reverberate throughout the centuries, from the classical age, through the Renaissance, and into the present day. Whether you're a longtime fan of Greek mythology or discovering these classic tales for the first time, prepare to be swept away by the timeless magic of Homer's storytelling. Let the adventure begin. Early references. Implicit references to Homer and quotations from the poems date to the middle of the 7th century BC. Archilochus, Alcman, Tertius, and Calinus in the 7th century, and Sappho and others in the early 6th adapted Homeric phraseology and meter to their own purposes and rhythms. At the same time, scenes from the epics became popular. In works of art, the pseudo-Homeric Hymn to Apollo of Delos, probably of late 7th century composition, claimed to be the work of a blind man who dwells in rugged Chios, a reference to a tradition about Homer himself. The idea that Homer had descendants known as Homeridae, and that they had taken over the preservation and propagation of his poetry, goes back at least to the early 6th century. BC.it was not long before a kind of Homeric scholarship began. Thea Genes of Rhegium in southern Italy toward the end of the same century wrote the first of many allegorizing interpretations. By the 5th century, biographical fictions were well underway. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus made use of a trivial legend of Homer's death, that it was caused by chagrin at not being able to solve some boys' riddle about catching lice, and the concept of a contest of quotations between Homer and Hesiod after Homer, the most ancient of Greek poets, may have been initiated in the sophistic tradition. The historian Herodotus assigned the formulation of Greek theology to Homer and Hesiod, and claimed that they could have lived no more than 400 years before his own time, the 5th century BC. This should be contrasted with the superficial assumption, popular in many circles throughout antiquity, that Homer must have lived not much later than the Trojan War about which he sang. The general belief that Homer was a native of Ionia, the central part of the western seaboard of Asia Minor, seems a reasonable conjecture, for the poems themselves are in predominantly Ionic dialect, although Smyrna and Chios early began competing for the honor. The poet Pindar, early in the 5th century BC, associated Homer with both, and others joined in. No authenticated local memory survived anywhere of someone who, oral poet or not, must have been remarkable in his time. Modern inferences. Modern scholars agree with the ancient sources only about Homer's general place of activity. The most concrete piece of ancient evidence is that his descendants, the Homeridae, lived on the Ionic island of Chios. Admittedly, there is some doubt over whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were even composed by the same main author. Such doubts began in antiquity itself and depended mainly on the difference of genre, the Iliad being martial and heroic, the Odyssey picaresque and often fantastic. But they may be reinforced by subtle differences of vocabulary, even apart from those imposed by different subjects. The similarities of the two poems are partly due to the coherence of the heroic poetical tradition that lay behind both, partly on the basis of the internal evidence of the poems, which is of some use in determining when Homer lived. It seems plausible to conclude that the period of composition of the large-scale epics, as distinct from their much shorter predecessors, was the 9th or 8th century, with several features pointing more clearly to the 8th. The Odyssey may belong near the end of this century, the Iliad closer to its middle. It may be no coincidence that cults of Homeric heroes tended to spring up toward the end of the 8th century, and that scenes from the epic begin to appear on pots at just about the same time. Homer as an oral poet, but even if his name is known and his date and region can be inferred, Homer remains primarily a projection of the great poems themselves. Their qualities are significant of his taste and his view of the world, but they also reveal something more specific about his technique and the kind of poet he was. Homeric tradition was an oral one. This was a kind of poetry made and passed down by word of mouth and without the intervention of writing. Indeed, Homer's own term for a poet is aoidos, singer, ordinary oidoi, whether resident at a royal court or performing at the invitation of a town's aristocracy, worked with relatively short poems that could be given completely on a single occasion. These poems must have provided the backbone of the tradition inherited by Homer. What Homer himself seems to have done is to introduce the concept of a quite different style of poetry in the shape of a monumental poem that required more than a single hour or evening to sing and could achieve new and far more complex effects in literary and psychological terms than those attainable in the more anecdotal and episodic songs of his predecessors. The poems, even apart from the possibilities of medium-scale elaboration, the Iliad and the Odyssey exemplify certain of the minor inconsistencies of all oral poetry, and occasionally the composer's amalgamation of traditional material into a large-scale structure shows through. Yet the overriding impression is one of powerful unity. The Iliad, consisting of more than 16,000 verses, which would have taken 4 or 5 long evenings, and perhaps more, to perform, is not merely a distillation of the whole protracted war against Troy. It is simultaneously an exploration of the heroic ideal in all its self-contradictoriness, its insane and grasping pride, its magnificent but animal strength, its ultimate, if obtuse, humanity. The poem is, in truth, the story of the wrath of Achilles, the greatest warrior on the Greek side. That is announced in its very first words. Yet for thousands of verses on end Achilles is an unseen presence. Much of the poetry between the first book, in which the quarrel flares up, and the 16th, in which Achilles makes the crucial concession of allowing his friend Patroclus to fight on his behalf, consists of long scenes of battle, in which individual encounters alternate with mass movements of the opposing armies. The battle poetry is based on typical and frequently recurring elements and motifs. But it is also subtly varied by highly individualized episodes and set pieces. The catalogue of troop contingents, the formal duels between Paris and Menelaus and Ajax and Hector, Helen's identifying of the Achaean princes, and so on. Patroclus's death to thirds of the way through the poem brings Achilles back into the fight. In Book 22, he kills the deluded Hector. Next, he restores his heroic status by means of the funeral games for Patroclus. And in the concluding book, Achilles is compelled by the gods to restore civilized values and his own magnanimity by surrendering Hector's body to King Priam. The Odyssey tends to be blander in expression and sometimes more diffuse in the progress of its action, but it presents an even more complex and harmonious structure than the Iliad. The main elements include the situation in Ithaca, where Penelope, Odysseus's wife, and their young son, Telemachus, are powerless before her arrogant suitors as they despair of Odysseus's return from the siege of Troy, as well as Telemachus's secret journey to the Peloponnese for news of his father, and his encounters there with Nestor, Menelaus, and Helen, Odysseus's dangerous passage, opposed by the sea god Poseidon himself, from Calypso's island to that of the Phaeacians, and his narrative of his fantastic adventures after leaving Troy, including his escape from the cave of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, Fall Lows, his arrival back in Ithaca, solitary and by night, at the poem's halfway point, is followed by his meeting with his protector goddess Athena, his elaborate disguises, his self-revelation to the faithful swineherd Eumaeus, and then to Telemachus, their complicated plan for disposing of the suitors, and its gory fulfillment. Finally comes the recognition by his faithful Penelope, his recounting to her of his adventures, his meeting with his aged father, Laertes, and the restitution, with Athena's help, of stability in his island. Kingdom of Ithaca, Homer's influence seems to have been strongest in some of the most conspicuous formal components of the poems. The participation of the gods can both dignify human events and make them seem trivial or tragic. It must for long have been part of the heroic tradition. But the frequency and the richness of the divine assemblies in the Iliad, or the peculiarly personal and ambivalent relationship between Odysseus and Athena in the Odyssey, probably reflect the taste and capacity of the main composer. The Iliad and the Odyssey owe their unique status to the creative confluence of tradition and design, the cries to lean fixity of a formulaic style, and the mobile spontaneity of a brilliant personal vision. The result is an impressive amalgam of literary power and refinement. The Iliad and the Odyssey, however, owe their preeminence not so much to their antiquity and to their place in Greek culture as a whole, but to their timeless success in expressing, on a massive scale, so much of the triumph and the frustration of human life.